It's teamwork that's important in life, not the individual. I've always felt that a champion is a person that repeats over and over again. But you know, you're only as good as your last game.
Hey guys, it's me, Cole, and it's been a very long time. Honestly, I've forgotten when I last uploaded, but I'm back, and today I'm going to talk about somebody that I wish I knew about as a kid. This guy, and I mean it when I say this isn't hyperbole, might be the most fascinating coach I've ever read about, because I never witnessed him, and I'm going to assume that none of you have witnessed him, because he passed away a long time ago, and I've been a college basketball diehard fan for all my life, and I've only ever heard of the name Al McGuire. I never really knew the story behind him, and my goodness, guys, just what I've read about learning about college basketball history, every single story just stood out to me about Al McGuire, and I just couldn't sit there anymore and just have that knowledge in my head. I had to share some of this knowledge with you guys because I never knew any of this stuff, and some of these stories, man, they are just something else. So thank you for tuning in. I know it's been a long time. I'm gonna try to post more consistently. I've honestly really missed it, which is the whole purpose, is I wanted to start uploading once I really missed it again, and it's finally happened, so here I am. And today we're talking about the legend himself, Al McGuire. And I've stumbled upon Al McGuire while researching about the history of college basketball. Now, I'm very passionate about all sports, but college basketball and specifically was like the number one sport that I fell in love with as a kid. And this is a guy that I didn't really know a whole lot about. I mean, I'd always been familiar with his name. I knew that Marquette wore his name on their uniforms, so I knew he was a really important figure because nobody in college sports does that. That's really just a professional sports thing. And the only one I can think of off the top of my head is George Halas on the Bears jerseys. So I was like, man, how important could this guy really be to have his name on their uniforms? Because not a single person in college athletics that I can think of has that. Now, I could be wrong. You have to let me know down in the comment section, but I think Marquette's the only one that wears somebody's name on their uniforms. And during my research on all of college basketball, I spent a lot of time really studying a lot of different coaches, and this was the one guy that always stuck out every single time I read something about this guy, and it just kept standing out more and more. The more I read, the more I researched. Al McGuire truly was, like, let's give you an example, a Mike Leach type of guy when it comes to just a crazy personality, does things that you'll never see again, which we haven't, and I just felt like I couldn't find many videos about him, so I decided to make my own video about him. Now, if you know who Al McGuire was, he was the head coach at Marquette from 1964 through 1977, winning a national championship in his final year there, taking them to another Final Four in 1974. He retired in 1977, the year he won a national championship, I think at the age of like 42, 44, somewhere around there, which is just insanely young to retire as a head coach, but he did that, and that's why I think his story really stands out to me, is because I feel like we kind of missed a little bit of Al McGuire. He did go on to TV, which I'll get into. Everything that he did, I mean, like, I can just go on and on. So we're going to get into that. I apologize if this is all out of order, but there's just so many stories with Al, and they kind of all stand on their own. So this might be a bit jumbled, but basically the bottom of the line is Al McGuire just was a fascinating, crazy figure. He had a long-standing beef with the NCAA. I mean, guys, this man hated the NCAA. He was first off the last head coach to ever let his team skip an NCAA tournament, which happened in 1970, when he basically said F you to the NCAA, took his team to the NIT. Again, this was the last time this has ever happened, when Marquette was put in a different region than they were supposed to be put in when they got put in Fort Worth over Dayton. Then he accused Adolph Rupp in Kentucky of exerting their influence to take the region that honestly he thought they deserved. I mean, the NCAA literally created a rule because of this, which was if you're invited to the NCAA tournament, you can't turn down the bid. You have to accept the bid if they invite you. He was a nutcase. Sometimes he couldn't remember his players' names. One practice in 1973, two of his players fought in practice. He then said to punch him first, and that player did, and then they just moved right on in practice. He had a picture of himself as a clown hanging in his office. I mean, this is the type of guy that would ride a motorcycle to practice, to work. He'd ride a motorcycle out of there, go do other things, and not even show up to practice. His quotes are just legendary.
I take Marcus out, and Marcus making goo-goo eyes at someone in back of the bench when the game's going on.
He said that he wouldn't recruit a kid with a front lawn. Winning is only important in surgery and wars. After winning the 1977 national title, he said he had never blown a whistle, looked at film, used a blackboard, or organized a practice. Some say he was the first to call top recruits blue chippers and referees zebras, which obviously everybody calls refs zebras, and everybody calls high-end talent blue chip prospects. And if he revolutionized that, I mean, he's revolutionized a lot of things. And the number one thing that he did was revolutionize the uniform game. Now, his time at Marquette was in the mid-60s all the way until the late 70s. So uniforms in sports really kind of started to take off during the 70s into the 80s. And I honestly think Marquette, like their uniform history, some of the combinations, some of the designs that they wore under Al McGuire are truly next level and changed the entire uniform landscape. And even up until this day, Marquette changed their uniforms every single year and they're always fresh and unique. And it's because of Al McGuire. It was something that he did when he was there. They changed their uniforms every single season. They were bold with all of their picks and definitely their colorway. I mean, back in the 70s, during my research, I couldn't find anybody that had crazy, wacky uniforms before. Like, they really started that movement, especially in the 70s. We see a lot of crazy uniforms in the 70s, the 80s, and all of the major sports leagues, but Marquette, they would change their uniforms every single year. They wore something crazy every single time. He wore crazy outfits on the sideline. He also let his players wear whatever they wanted, and their team pictures were something else, guys. In their 1976 team picture, they all wore medieval costumes. Then the next year, they stood in front of a convertible in suits. And for a team so disciplined, Al McGuire, he kind of let loose when it comes to like the uniform game, letting his players kind of wear whatever they wanted, but they always kind of did it as a team, which I think really stood out to me. When it came to his coaching style, Al McGuire was really all over the place. I read that he would often skip practice to chase other pursuits, so his assistants, Hank Raymonds and Rick Majerus, led their team practices. For recruiting, he never watched a player, he just let his staff make recommendations, and then he would visit the prospect just one time and would never beg them to come. He said, "You should never change anything once the season starts when it comes to adjustments." What? Now, he said this was because he wanted his opposition to adjust to his team's playing style and said, if you have indecision, your players will act accordingly. So I kind of understand where he's coming from when it comes to that, but to not make adjustments throughout a season, my goodness, like how could you even get away with something like that? Now let's talk about some of the key seasons to remember with Marquette basketball under Al, because his time was pretty short as a head coach. They made 2 Final Fours like I mentioned, and let's start with the 1974 season because some interesting things happened with Al. During the 1974 ride to the national title in the Final Four versus Kansas, down 24-23 at half, Al chewed out Lloyd Walton, one of his players, so badly he refused to come out of the locker room and showered. Did come back in though. In the title game, he picked up 2 technical fouls, yes, 2 technicals, and during the tournament, before he even received those, he had 1 versus Ohio, 2 versus Michigan, and then he obviously had 2 in the national title game when they lost to North Carolina State. He said it really cost his team the game, but he said officials never win or lose a game. Then he followed up by saying, "I would rather not discuss the calls because I'm absolutely correct." 2 years later, in 1976, they lost to the last undefeated team in college basketball history in Indiana, in which Al once again was teed up, and after he said that if he made another tournament, he would let his assistants handle the game, since he cost his team, and all those guys would actually come back, and they would actually make the national championship the next year. His final season, he announced he was retiring at the end of the season. He rode a motorcycle around Atlanta when they got there for the Final Four. They won the national title over North Carolina as a huge underdog, and his team almost didn't even make that tournament because he was consistently beefing with the NCAA. During the title game, his wife yelled at him for yelling too much during the game. He cried during the final minute of the game on the sideline and didn't want to be in the team picture because he felt the players were the ones who deserved that moment, and he was the first coach to ever do that, to not be in a team picture. Now, after his final season in 1977 when they won the national championship, he said that he was retiring to take on a VP role at a sports goods store in Milwaukee, which he was only at for a year. Al McGuire retired at 48 years old. There's guys coaching in their 70s, almost into their 80s. Al McGuire retired at 48. We didn't get enough of him as a head coach. I don't remember any of that, obviously. I wasn't alive. But Al McGuire, he went into TV, which he was fantastic at, which I think that's how a lot of people even know who Al was, because he was just so funny on TV. And obviously, if you're much older than me watching this video, you might even remember Al McGuire when he called games. Al McGuire, I think, passed away in the early 2000s, but definitely called a lot of high-profile college basketball games. And I was rewatching a lot of Big East games, and I was rewatching a documentary about the Big East, a 30 for 30. And Al McGuire was usually on the call for some of those games.
That's when it looks like a pizza that was dropped in the street.
I think he worked for NBC. He worked with Dick Enberg as well, a famous play-by-play announcer who actually wrote a play about Al McGuire. Yes, wrote a play that is performed live in front of an audience. Just the countless stories about Al McGuire just stood out to me to make this video. And I know this was a little bit random. Obviously it's random. I'm uploading, so that's pretty random itself. But to start back with Al McGuire, I felt like he was just a guy that he's been on my mind a lot, and I just couldn't believe some of these stories I was reading about him. Truly a fascinating character, a Mike Leach type of character. Obviously, when you hear a name from so long ago, you can't really like connect with it. You kind of have to like read about it and study it for a little bit and kind of watch some videos about Al McGuire, but there's just not a whole lot out there on YouTube. So that's why I made the video. So I really hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.